All right, welcome to week 5. This is module 9, and our subject is interest groups, which refer to private member organizations comprised of like-minded individuals who have some interest in influencing public policy. Those interests can be economic or moral or otherwise public in nature. Economic interest groups tend to be, ironically enough, the best funded and the most cohesive. Interest groups are like but distinct from political parties in that where parties want to compete, with people, with candidates, they want to recruit candidates to win elections and control government. Interest groups are primarily interested in simply influencing the direction of government. Typically, interest groups are also different from political movements, which tend to be more focused on specific goals. The assigned reading discusses the civil rights movement's goal was to change societal attitudes towards racial and ethnic minority groups. To achieve that end, individuals formed groups like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. In other words, a political movement may spin off interest groups, but they are in many instances distinct. The movement may be broader and may include other interest groups. As I noted in the Module 8 presentation, interest groups and political parties differ in that, again, parties view control of governmental institutions as a primary end, while interest groups are more interested in influencing the actions and policies for some other purpose. Ultimately, while many of the goals of interest groups and political parties are similar, interest groups generally have a narrower focus: civil liberties, environmental protections, the rights of gun owners, things like that. As I mentioned in a previous presentation, interest groups, political parties, and the media serve important roles as intermediary institutions. And again, those are these institutions that exist between the people and the federal branches of the government, the three big branches of the government, and the civil service that help citizens identify and articulate their interests to the formal institutions of government. People have been thinking about the role of interest groups in the governing process for a long time. In the assigned reading, James Madison's Federalist Number 10 highlights the problem of faction in democracies, which is how Americans in the late 18th century described interest groups. Madison was drawing on the work of the French noble-born philosopher Baron de Montesquieu, who believed that a republican system would destroy itself due to what he called the mischiefs of faction. Montesquieu believed that only small republics could control factional disputes. What you're left with is a sense in which governments really only have one option relative to the potential dangers of faction, which is to suppress them through authoritarian means. In analyzing Montesquieu's theory, Madison observed that liberty is to faction as air is to fire. Now, what did he mean by that? I think Madison is saying a couple of things. First, liberty will inevitably produce interest group formation. Second, like fire, interest groups seeking to enhance their influence with government is potentially dangerous. But third, like fire, interest group activity, if confined and controlled, can be a useful tool of governance. So Madison's solution to the problem of faction is not, like Montesquieu, to advocate for a small, poor republic, but instead, Madison believed that a large republican system, like the one that they were conceiving, would prove to be sufficiently robust as to absorb and constrain the aspirations of interest groups. The assigned reading asserts that Madison is elaborating on a theory of interest group activity known as pluralism, which is the idea that the prevalence of many competing interests prevent any one group from dominating the political system. A little more than 2 generations later, a young French nobleman named Alexis de Tocqueville came to the United States with a companion to study the United States prison systems. From his extensive travels, and he traveled throughout the existing United States for nearly 9 months, he published a magisterial 2-volume work entitled Democracy in America. They were published in installments. The first one was published in 1835, the second in 1840, and the books remain a classic on American democracy. And in it, Tocqueville argues that America's individualistic political culture was sort of unique to America and sort of an inevitable feature of the leveling impulses of democracy, right? America didn't have a nobility, didn't have a king, and he said that affected citizens. He said that Americans in that period had a penchant for association, and he described Americans as a nation of joiners, which he kind of viewed as a strength that distinguished America from European nations. But he also saw in American democracy a tendency towards conformity, which might lead to what he characterized as the tyranny of the majority that would culminate in despotism. Does that sound like a prescient warning in our current environment? In a sense, both Madison and Tocqueville are illustrations of pluralist theories of interest groups. Madison, in a sense, is arguing that a large Republican scheme, like the one elaborated in the Constitution, constructs a cage of competition. Interest groups are free to compete, but are unable to dominate because of the countervailing forces of other interest groups. I think for much of U.S. history, that view of pluralism, that view of interest group politics was relatively accurate. I think what has happened over the course of the latter half of the 20th century and into the first 2 decades of the 21st century is that interest groups are now becoming so affluent and so powerful and so adept at manipulation that they're increasingly able to clear the field of rival interests and manipulate the government to suit themselves. The next thing I want to talk about are and again, this is something, if you're interested and you want to talk more about it, talk to me in the weekly discussion. The next thing I want to discuss are the functions that interest groups play. First and foremost, interest groups are good at educating the public about specific policies. That's particularly true when an interest group's economic activity are imperiled by a contemplated government policy. Second, interest groups provide guidance for individuals deciding, which candidates to support. In recent years, interest groups have organized political action committees, and they will often pay a lot for advertising calculated to favor a particular candidate or party. That's been particularly true of the NRA, which has gone from being sort of we'll support anyone who's pro-gun to throwing close to 90% of all their money, all their campaign donations in the direction of Republicans. Third, interest groups serve as a check on government by letting people know how to influence the government's decisions. Again, interest groups run a lot of advertising seeking to alert and influence voters about a policy that's being considered. Fourth, interest groups enhance the efficacy of individuals by communicating to interest group members and the public what actions they can take to register their support or opposition to a policy. The Harvard political scientist Robert Putnam used the term social capital to refer to that sense in which people feel empowered by engaging in a collective cause. To contrast the importance of social capital, Putnam discusses the challenges presented by what Edward Banfield describes as amoral familialism, to describe the political cultures of Southern European nations like Italy and Greece, where citizens of those countries felt intense mistrust of government and of outsiders generally, and only trusted those members of their immediate family, which erects enormous and sometimes insurmountable barriers to any kind of collective action, and that impoverishes has led to the impoverishment of those countries. The essence of amoral familialism is the complete lack of trust in others. And if you think about the Southern European countries, Spain had a long period of Muslim domination. Italy was dominated by Spain, France, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire for long periods of time. Greece was basically dominated by the Ottoman Turk Empire for a very long time. So when they see government, they see others, right? Fifth, interest groups are able to educate policymakers who are then able to, and they do that by hiring lobbyists who generally your ability to work as a lobbyist means I can open doors. I can get members of Congress to see me. In many instances, legislation is literally written by interest group policy experts and handed off to members of Congress who then stamp their names on them and submit them. One of the good things about interest groups is that they can act as force multipliers for people in those specific groups. Interest groups attempt to attract members by providing important benefits. In the assigned reading, for example, they discuss three kinds of benefits. The idea of solidarity benefits, that again, you feel the sense of community by being in association with like-minded people. Purposive benefits, the satisfaction people derive from knowing they're engaged in an important goal or serving an important cause. And then material benefits. Some people actually make careers out of working for interest groups, and if they have a skill set, they get salaries and health benefits, and then interest groups also provide discounts on the services that they provide. A lot of them publish magazines and things like that you can get at a discounted rate if you're a member. Of course, with human nature being what it is, virtue can easily be converted to vice. Many of the positive functions of interest groups can be subverted by interests who do not respect the rule of law, do not respect the Constitution, and who are perfectly willing to destroy the federal government to protect and advance their interests. Some people believe that their economic or moral interests are better served by chaos and anarchy. The assigned reading surveys some of the criticisms of interest groups, including the domination of politics by special interests, which basically refers to powerful and wealthy people who seek to use their money and influence to magnify their influence over policy. An even greater exaggeration of the importance of money in politics, as if the role of money needs greater exaggeration. Third, interest groups tend to reinforce already powerful advantages that incumbents enjoy in seeking re-election, which can have the effect of insulating incumbents from electoral accountability. Fourth, Theodore Lowy argued in a book that he wrote in the 20th century called The End of Liberalism that interest groups had proliferated and that had led to the growth of the federal government and the diminution of democratic accountability. And so again, that's an argument that interest groups are oftentimes hostile to democracy. Supporters of interest groups contend that interest groups play a vital role. Again, I mentioned this idea of intermediary institutions. They argue that money in society, in any society that's organized along capitalist principles, will always play an integral role in politics, and that incumbents have other more important advantages than interest group support. And likewise, Lowy's argument doesn't really provide an alternative or pathway out of what he describes as interest group liberalism. The assigned reading traces the evolution of interest groups over the course of American history. I think it's important to note that part of the reason why interest groups have asserted so much influence in American politics has something to do with how weak American political parties have been over the course of American history. So historically, the emergence of interest groups has been strongly correlated with grievances of groups of people who lacked a voice within the political system. The abolitionist movement prior to the Civil War, the suffragist movement for women to earn the right to vote, illustrate this sense in which the voiceless asserted themselves in the 19th century. And with women, they didn't actually achieve until 1920. With the ratification of the 19th Amendment, the right for women to vote. The progressive era is very important for understanding the increasing intensification of interest group activity. The progressive movement, basically from the late 19th century to around 1920, was a good government movement. It was comprised largely of journalists, academics, and other professionals, kind of middle-class people that achieved a number of really important reforms in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And again, when you think about it, you have the Civil War amendments, which are immensely important, the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments. And then you have the progressive era, amendments that were all kind of conceived between 1913 and 1920. When you think about the level of constitutional revision that took place in that period, it's incredibly important. The 16th Amendment, which provides for the income tax, the 17th Amendment, which provides for the direct statewide election of senators, the 18th Amendment, which banned the manufacture and prohibition of alcohol, and the 19th Amendment, which extended to women the right to vote. It illustrates both the strengths and, to me, the weaknesses of the progressive era. The progressives tended to have a deep belief and fascination with the idea of silver bullets. For example, the prohibition, the 18th Amendment, was basically predicated on the idea that all manner of society's ills could be resolved if we just stopped drinking, and if we could force people to stop drinking, that would that would work a miracle. Well, what it did was it turned a lot of Americans into lawbreakers, and eventually, of course, after what was it, about 13 years, the 18th Amendment was subsequently repealed. Nevertheless, though, 3 out of 4 amendments were, again, really important game-changing kinds of rule changes. In the 20th century, there were several distinct phases of interest group activity. Prior to World War II, labor unions succeeded over the course of the Progressive Era and the New Deal to earn legal recognition and ultimately to win the right to organize in workplaces. Over the course of the remainder of the 20th century, business-oriented interest groups effectively reversed those legal rights and really rendered, unions, private unions, especially private sector unions, really kind of, it really, hamstrung them and made them much weaker. Today, only a tiny portion of the private sector workforce is unionized, and really not that many in the public sector as well. In the post-World War II era, the proliferation of civil rights movements emerged to combat historic discrimination against blacks, women, Hispanics, and members of the LGBTQ movement. Many interest groups patterned their strategies after the Black Civil Rights Movement, which was much, they got organized a lot earlier, and they fought a lot harder, and they used a combination of legal challenges to discriminatory laws and then direct nonviolent confrontation to combat segregation. I want to close by touching on the role the internet and social media has played in contemporary interest group politics. With the emergence of the internet in the early 1990s, the very nature of interest groups were transformed from kind of a labor-intensive and intimately democratic process of outreach to instantaneous interactions through social media. And of course, that has both good and bad implications. The upside of the use of social media as a tool for outreach and involvement is the ease with which people can involve themselves in that sort of interest group activism. A lot of people these days spend a lot of time and money, consuming social media, and a lot of the stuff that they're doing is being produced by interest groups, and they contribute billions of dollars annually to major interest groups. But as I noted a moment ago, all virtue can be rendered into vice. There are serious questions about whether internet-oriented political activism is the same and has the same quality as someone who physically engages in political activism. The assigned reading uses the term slacktivism to denote the possibility that internet-oriented activities is activism for people who don't want to leave their homes. More importantly, and perhaps more ominously, the internet has proven to be an effective tool for radicalization. I don't think there's any question that a lot of Donald Trump supporters were radicalized online, and I would say this as someone who studies terrorism quite a bit. That has also been a very effective recruitment tool for terrorist organizations. All right, I hope this presentation helps you understand the assigned readings. There's a lot more in there. Things like the free rider problem and stuff like that. I hope you will help me help you by letting me know which aspects of the readings you're having difficulty understanding. Let's have a great week.